Thanks very much, Marshall. Really pleasure to be here and pleasure to have such a great turnout on a very cold, snowy, difficult to get around kind of day in February. So thank you very much for being here. Just a quick, is the sound check okay on the, okay, terrific. If the resolution on the wall screen that we have here doesn't work well for you, there are two monitors that might be a little bit brighter and easier to see. If you're looking to get closer to anything, you might check those out. Okay, so I have an overly ambitious plan for us for the next hour. So we're gonna tackle 5 questions, and I'm gonna start with the basics. So that we're just gonna start with basic. Let's all get on the same page. This is to talk about democracy. So what is democracy? And then what is the United States? And then how are we doing, which is the main crux of the talk, really. And then how did we get here, and what happens next? And if you think the outline sounds a little bit like the lyrics to a Talking Heads song, then we can be friends. Okay, so what is democracy? Just starting with the basics here to make sure we're all on the same page about the language that we're using, because there are different definitions of democracy that get used. Merriam-Webster, with the dictionary, defines it as a form of government in which people elect representatives to make decisions, policies, laws, etc. If we go and look at Adam Przorsky, who is a well-known political scientist, he defines elections as a system in which parties lose elections. And that losing elections part is critical to understanding how the functions of democracies work. So that's a very simple definition that sort of packs a lot in a few words. Abraham Lincoln defined democracy as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So that's probably a phrase you've heard before. So we're going to get a little bit more social sciencey in how we think about democracy. Because if we played word association right now, and if I said democracy and asked you to think of a bunch of things, you might come up with a bunch of the kinds of words that are in the word cloud on the screen. But I'm going to ask you to keep 4 key things in mind, and this is the part that will be on the quiz. So this is the thing that I actually want you to try to remember. So thing number 1 is democracies have free and fair elections. Number 2 is democracies guarantee voting rights for the adults in their sovereignty. Number 3, democracies guarantee civil liberties, so these are individual freedoms. And number 4, democracies operate under a rule of law. So free and fair elections, voting rights, civil liberties, and rule of law. Those are the 4 things. I wish I had a cute mnemonic for how to remember it, but I don't have one yet. Okay, because we're going to come back to these things. Okay, now that we understand kind of what democracy is, I'm defining democracy by these 4 activities, really. Let's talk about the United States. One thing that often comes up at the beginning of one of these kinds of things about the United States and democracy is there's invariably somebody who says, we're not a democracy, we're a republic actually, right? And so let's just take that head on. What are we in fact? So the reason this gets confusing is because of sort of a rhetorical accident of history. The word republic comes from Latin, res meaning entity or concern, and publicus meaning of the people, or public, so republic. Democracy comes from the Greek, demos meaning the people, and kratia meaning rule or power. And so both of these words essentially are synonyms that come from different derivatives. And the reason they've gotten confused and have followed different definitions, we can blame on this guy. This is James Madison. He is the author of Federalist Number 10. And he would say that a pure democracy would consist of a small society where everyone participates in governing, but that a republic refers to a system of representation. So in his essays, which were largely all about trying to convince people to adopt the Constitution after the Constitutional Convention, he was trying to make a distinguishing case between what is a democracy and what is a republic for the sake of his own arguments. But this has caused some confusion these days, I would say. The United States, of course, contains both of these elements. Both a small society where people participate in governing and a system of representation. And so if we think of the United States today, I would call it both a republic and a democracy. The political science definition of a republic is essentially a government that doesn't have a king. So if you're not a monarch, you are a republic. If you go to England, I've been watching for reasons I can't explain. I've been watching reruns of Downton Abbey lately. I don't know why. And Tom Branson is always talking about how he's a Republican, and this is just the people who were against the monarchy, right? So the Republic means there is no monarch. The authority for the government comes from the people. The democracy part means that the people rule. The people are the source of power. It is the nexus of the sovereignty, of the sovereign power comes from the people. We are also a constitutional republic, meaning that we have our government is constrained by agreed upon rules that are written down in our constitution, and we are also a representative form of government. So we are all of these things in the United States, and so we're not a democracy, actually a republic thing doesn't hold water with me, because if we're using those sort of formal definitions, then the answer to all of those things are yes. To further kind of think about this as a thought experiment, or to get these things straight, we can think of countries in the world that are republics and not republics. And we can think of countries in the world that are democracies and not democracies. So just from the class here, what country would you put in this upper left quadrant that is both a republic and a democracy? I gave you the answer a second ago.
Yeah. United States.
The United States. So we could put the United States in that box, South Korea, Italy, France, Germany, Israel, a number of others obviously could go there. What would you put in the democracy but not a republic box?
Sweden.
Sweden. Okay, good. What else?
United Kingdom.
United Kingdom, right? So anything that still has a king these days. So the UK, Canada, Australia, Spain, New Zealand, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, etc. Okay, so what is a republic and not a democracy? A dictatorship, essentially, yeah. So we could put China in that box, North Korea, Cuba. They don't operate as democracies and they are not republics. They don't have kings. What are things that are not democracies that are republics? Excuse me, not a republic, not a democracy, not a republic.
Russia?
Russia doesn't have a king, well, Russia I would actually put up here, I think. Jordan, yes, I would put Jordan in that box. I would put Morocco in that box. Saudi Arabia in that box. Brunei, Oman, Qatar, right? So not a republic because they have a monarch, but also not a democracy, right? Okay, so republic and democracy mean different things, but so I'm not saying they are fully synonyms, but to treat it appropriately, we're going to call the United States, we're going to categorize it as both a republic and a democracy. Okay, before we can go further then, we need to talk about regime types. So when we talk about democracy, we have the four things. So here's the pop quiz. Can anybody remember? Who can remember one of the four things? Free and fair elections.
Voting rights.
Rule of law, voting rights. Civil liberties. Excellent. You guys get an A. Okay, so free and fair elections, voting rights, rule of law, civil liberties. We might also say that democracies include checks on executive authority. Democracies include an uncertainty in outcomes where the elections are actually uncertain. You don't know how the elections are going to turn out. We have a legitimacy through a consent of the governed. This is known as popular sovereignty. So countries like Canada, Japan, Germany, etc. On the other end of the spectrum, we have authoritarianism. Authoritarianism does not have free and fair elections. They have no meaningful elections. There are no voting rights because there are no elections. And the rule is by the rulers, not by the rule of law. Civil liberties are generally quite suppressed. There's no real checks on executive authority. If there are any kind of elections, there are predetermined outcomes, or in a policy-making process, they are predetermined. And the legitimacy comes through the coercion or some kind of tradition in that country. So North Korea, Saudi Arabia, some of those things we were just talking about. So there are, and I'm oversimplifying, of course, for the sake of the lesson, really, but there are things that are kind of mixed. Like these are kind of the two ends of the scale. But the thing that I want to familiarize you with, if you're not already, is what we call competitive authoritarianism. This goes by lots of different terms. I'm going to use the competitive authoritarianism version. What competitive authoritarian means, the reason it's competitive is because you still have elections. Parties are still competing for power, and many of those elections may still be perfectly competitive, valid, legitimate. But there are still many elements of authoritarianism in the system such that many of those elections may be kind of stacked in favor of one party or the other, or something like that. So in a competitive authoritarian system, you have elections, elections exist, but they might be unfair, or they might be regionally unfair in some places and not in others. Voting rights tend to be quite constrained. You have very weak rule of law. You have civil liberties that are quite curtailed. You have checks on executive authority that are undermined. Incumbent advantage dominates, so incumbents just tend to stay in power. And you have legitimacy through managed pluralism, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying that it's not popular sovereignty by the people granting the government their power, but it's some factions that are doing that. So Hungary, Venezuela are examples of those. Okay. The other thing that we need to have in our toolkit here as we understand what's going on with US democracy is that, and I didn't put it on the list before, but the United States is also a presidential system. And presidential systems, it turns out, have very specific vulnerabilities. So the political scientist Juan Linz wrote some really prescient stuff in the 1990s showing that presidential systems often tend to democratic presidential systems often tend to backslide into authoritarianism because of the zero-sum nature of presidential elections. Because presidents kind of have this one-person style authority, and when you get the idea that parties can win or lose everything based on the election of this one person, it creates a deterioration of the competitive process. And so we saw examples of this in Nicaragua, in Chile, in Russia, in Venezuela, in Turkey. And for a long time, political scientists thought, but what about the US? The US is a presidential system, and it was believed that the United States was an exception to the Juan Linz rule, that the United States wouldn't backslide into authoritarianism as a presidential system. And the two features that they thought were protecting the US were, one, there are ideologically moderate political majorities, and if you think about the most of the 20th century in the United States, we had lots of ideological moderates in the parties, and there were robust political parties at that time as well. And so that supposition made sense, but these days we now have hyperpolarization, which I'll talk about later, and weak political parties in terms of the organizations themselves tend to be very weak in how they nominate their candidates. And because of the polarization and the weak parties, it has made the presidential system in the United States vulnerable to autocracy in the same way that all the other presidential systems have been. So no longer are we special or an exception in that regard. And that's a bit of a preview, I guess, to where we're going. Okay, the other thing to appreciate is that democracy is in decline globally. So people that measure the democracy kind of index over a 20-year period or so, you can see 2006 is on the left, and more blue is more democratic, and more orange or red is less democratic. And you can see that the whole map is shifted towards less blue and more orange and red and yellow in the more recent period. So this is not something that just the United States is experiencing. This is a global phenomenon, and we'll get into some of the reasons for that in a little bit. This graph I'm going to skip. It says the same thing. Support for democracy across the globe is declining in lots of places, and this graph says the same thing. And because I made too many slides, I'm just going to skip a few. So if you see one you want to come back to later, we can do it again. Okay, we're on to question 3. How are we doing? So if we just ask people how they're doing, which the Gallup organization does and has been doing for a long time, quite regularly, we find that satisfaction with how things are going in the United States is historically low. So this graph goes almost over my whole lifetime here, starting in the late 1970s towards, I think this last poll was in January of 2026. And you can see that the average of percent of people who say they are satisfied with how things are going is now at about 24%. And you see quite a bit of variation across time, but also there are some pretty clear trends, and we're at a real low point here. And so if you ask people how the US is doing in general, they think it's not going well. We also have historic levels of distrust in government, and I didn't put that graph in the slides, but also historic levels of distrust in the media, except that the distrust in the media is bifurcated by partisanship. So this graph, also from Gallup here, from the early 2000s through modern day, The red line is showing how the percentage of people who identify as Republicans who have zero trust in the mass media. So 59% of Republicans have zero trust in the mass media. And the blue line is for Democrats, so below 10% for most of the time period. So Republicans particularly have become distrustful of the mass media, and that's largely because the mass media that they listen to tells them to distrust the mass media.
Could you define mass media to be certain what on the site?
So this is going to be, the poll will be done by Gallup's definition of mass media. So they'll say, such as newspapers, TV, and radio. So they don't get real specific. It's going to be in the mind of the respondent in that sense. But good question. All right. The other thing I want to do to think about where the U.S. is, trying to assess things right now, is to try to summarize what's gone on in the last year, which is quite difficult actually, because a lot has gone on. So this is just sort of a summary of some key sort of statistics. So starting at the top, so the net worth of Donald Trump, and actually I made this slide in December at the end of my fall classes, this particular slide. And so this is just for 2025. I happen to know that it's actually gone up since then. The net worth of Donald Trump in his own personal assets is $3 billion. In 2024, his net worth has increased by $3 billion, is what I'm trying to say. In 2024, it was around $4 billion, and in 2025, it was around $7 billion. So he's made $3 billion himself off of the presidency, which is a violation of the Constitution. The vast majority of that is in his crypto business. According to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE, they have detained 1 million people. Excuse me, that's not according to ICE. That's according to the Center for Immigration Studies. We actually don't have the numbers from ICE. The same period during the Biden administration, during the first year of the Biden presidency, and President Biden did come under quite a bit of criticism for the quantity and the method by which they did, in that administration, that they did deportations. But it was about half as much. So Biden had about 500,000 in the same time period. The scholars are projecting, so this is a projection, not actual count yet, but people are projecting that globally the deaths due to the loss of USAID and funding changes will be about 650,000 people. We have lost over 200,000 people in the federal workforce due to firings, resignations, DOGE actions, and so forth. The measles one is now more than 8 weeks out of date, so the number is quite a bit higher now. There's an outbreak happening in Georgia as we speak, or in North Carolina. So around 2,000 measles cases, which is very unusual for a disease that does not need to be so prevalent. 87 deaths due to U.S. military boat strikes in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and 9 firms in which the U.S. government now holds investment stakes. So the U.S. government is now an investment holder in 9 private industries, mostly having to do with mining and other technology and so forth. Intel being one of them. Okay, you guys lived through the last year, and so I'm not gonna walk through my whole little timeline. I'll just pull out a few here and there to give you a sense. But the idea is that the amount of activity that has come from the central government, basically directed from the White House, is alarmingly unusual. At the very beginning of his presidency in 2025, President Trump pardoned 1,500 Capitol rioters who had participated in the January 6, 2021 insurrection. Closed USAID, departed from the Paris Climate Accords and the WHO, fired prosecutors from the DOJ and inspectors general. In February, we saw stripping of power from independent regulatory agencies like the SEC and FTC. We've seen significant loss of grants to science organizations. In March, we saw demands made of law firms and of universities, mine being one. Deportations to Venezuela of migrants. We deported Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador, is what I'm trying to say. We changed our tariff policy dramatically, just to understate things, and for a little international affairs, Israel also began resuming strikes on Gaza that month. In April, we saw detentions of international college students. We saw more demands of universities, mass deportations without due process, and travel advisories were placed on the United States by other countries, suggesting the United States is not a safe place for people to travel. In May, we saw a 10% decline in the federal workforce. Qatar gifted Trump an airplane, and the Republicans passed tax cut legislation. In June, we sent Marines into Los Angeles and National Guard into California. We instituted a travel ban on 12 countries, put tariffs on steel and aluminum, took stakes in private countries, in U.S. Steel rather, and Representative Melissa Hortman was assassinated in Minnesota. In July, the Alligator Alcatraz, so-called, was opened in Florida as a detention center. We saw a rescissions package approved. I'm not going to go into fiscal politics, but that's really unusual to have Congress take money back. We saw U.S. drone strikes in Yemen and Secretary Hegseth's Signalgate, if you remember that one. We saw the U.S. take stakes in materials company. In August, we saw the firing of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We saw federal troops deployed to Washington, D.C. The U.S. took a 10% stake in Intel, and the CDC director was ousted, and Texas passed their redistricting. In September, Charlie Kirk was assassinated. So that's two notes of significant political violence. We saw the release of the Epstein evidence, the first release at least. More U.S. troops in the Caribbean, Israel expanding against Qatar, and then Jimmy Kimmel was temporarily removed from his post for criticizing the president. In October, we saw the prosecutions of political opponents, Letitia James and James Comey. The East Wing of the White House was raised. The government shut down for the longest period ever, 43 days. Trump asked the DOJ for a personal payout. That one comes back in a few months. Israel struck a peace deal with Gaza, and we saw significant changes to the Pentagon press pool and federal troops in Chicago and Memphis. In November, we saw significant new pardons, such as Rudy Giuliani and Mark Meadows. We saw boat strikes in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, U.S. strikes in Iran, federal troops in North Carolina, and California passed its mid-decade redistricting. In December, we saw CDC changes to the childhood vaccination schedule. We saw more boat strikes, FBI investigations of members of Congress, and federal troops in New Orleans and Minneapolis. In January, we saw the United States remove the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, from power. ICE killed 2 civilians in Minneapolis, more political violence. The Smithsonian and National Portrait Gallery were scrubbed of ideology, and thousands were killed in protests in Iran. 5-year-old Liam Ramos was taken. The U.S. threatened Greenland, and Trump demanded that the Department of Justice pay him $10 billion to compensate him for what he claimed were false lawsuits previously. Today is February 7th. We've got the Melania movie, which is a form of corruption. We've got a deal between Trump, UAE, regarding crypto. We're closing the Kennedy Center. We've got measles outbreaks. We're jailing journalists. So notably, well-known journalist Don Lemon is now in jail, or was arrested, I should say, not currently in prison. And the Trump administration seized ballots from the 2020 election in the state of Georgia. A lot has been going on. We've also seen an unusual usage of the pardon power. So this is a constitutional power given to presidents. And Donald Trump has pardoned, just in his first year in office, has pardoned significantly more people than any president in modern times has. This is data that the New York Times did a great series a month or two ago about the loss of science funding. So that's just summarizing some of theirs. This is more about the tariffs. We've had just really volatile tariff policy. The United States is now getting more revenue from tariffs than we had before to try to accommodate for how Donald Trump thinks about foreign policy in a very transactional manner. Okay, that was all background. You've lived through all of that. Maybe you didn't need to summarize it, but I do think it's hard to take it all in when it happens all at once. And of course, I didn't mention everything, but this is to say that there's a lot going on. So, folks at Dartmouth University have been surveying both experts and the mass public for the last decade or so, asking them about how they think democracy in the United States is doing. Their survey is broad. They ask about a lot of things. I actually followed into their expert panel. And so what you have here is starting from 2017, their most recent survey was in December 2025, I think, or maybe it was November. September 2025. The green line is how the experts, so that's me and whoever else is in their sample, how the experts, they just say like rate US democracy on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is full authoritarianism and 100 is perfect democracy. Like, where is the United States today? And so what you can see here is the green line is the experts, the red line are Republicans, not experts, but just the mass public, and the blue line is Democrats. And the squares are Republicans and Democrats aggregated. So what you essentially can see is that the experts were more bullish about democracy than the general public all through the first Trump administration, right? So people were alarmed of things going on in the Trump administration that were definitely abnormal, but the experts were they're looking at the checklist, rule of law, free and fair elections, voting rights, civil liberties, and they're like, challenges here and there, but by and large, this stuff is still intact. And so the experts are like, this is okay, and they were more sanguine about things than the public was. When Joe Biden is inaugurated, you can see that Republicans' evaluation of U.S. democracy, of course, they believe wrongly that the election has been stolen, and so we see this huge drop here is because of the belief of a stolen election among Republicans. Experts and Democrats generally feel better about democracy during the Biden administration. As soon as Trump is inaugurated in 2025, we see a huge drop in both the experts and the Democrats. In the latest survey, the Republicans feel better about democracy than the experts do. So we no longer have sort of that sanguine thing about the experts that we did previously. There's also other systems that measure how U.S. democracy is doing. One's called the VDEM Institute, another is the Center for Systemic Peace. This graph is just a visualization to try to explain how the U.S. has sort of fallen on their liberal democracy scale. But to summarize it, experts essentially now classify the United States as a competitive authoritarian regime, right? We still have elections. Lots of things are still functioning, but we have seen sufficient challenges to the rule of law and to other aspects of how democracies function that most experts are not calling the United States a full democracy anymore. It's a backsliding democracy. So I've done a little bit of my own research in this area. There's a journalist by the name of Olga Lautman who keeps a daily sort of ongoing on Substack, a tracker of events that happen. And I don't read it in detail, but what I did was go scrape all of her data, with her permission, by the way, and applied a machine learning algorithm, essentially, to each of those events, and said, how many of these events threaten democracy? Do they threaten the rule of law, civil liberties, voting rights, free and fair elections? And she's just cataloging all this stuff, and then I'm just categorizing it, essentially. And so there's more than 9,000 events that are in her catalog over the course of 2025, over 310 days. Most of the events met the criteria for at least one of the 4 threats that I was measuring for. 23% of events did not meet the criteria for any threat under my classification. Of the 4 things, rule of law, free and fair elections, voting rights, and civil liberties, of all the stuff that's happened in the last year, which of those 4 would you say has been the most threatened? Rule of law. Who says rule of law? Who says civil liberties? Who says voting rights? Free and fair elections? All right, you guys did pretty well on your test. It's rule of law. So by far, so the blue one is rule of law. This one, the orange one here, this is civil liberties. Green is free and fair elections, and red is voting rights. So of all of the threats that are posed by these various activities, by and large, the primary threat we are seeing is threats to the rule of law. One sort of tiny silver lining I take away from all this is that over the course of the year, it's not, I don't see a lot of variation. We don't have no slope here, right? If I put slopes on each of these lines, they're basically flat lines, right? So that is to say it's not getting worse. Of course, this is not a random sample of data. This is just, from the events that this one journalist catalogs, and so it's not a perfect way to measure or not whether or not things are getting worse. But perhaps it's something to take away. Okay, on to number 4. Doing okay with the time. How did we get here? So this is where I warn you that you walked into a class that puts like 3 semesters of content into 1 hour. And so if you haven't learned anything new yet, this is where things maybe get more interesting. Because I'm going to tell a story about how we actually got here, and I'm going to try to do it succinctly. Point number 1 in the how we got here story is about partisan polarization. So this is a very busy graph about Congress, and every dot on this graph is the ideal point of a member of Congress that measures their ideology, and it goes from the first Congress in 1789 up until 2025. And what you have here is a summary of partisanship across time, across all of the Congresses. So if we just come to the start in the 20th century, essentially what I want you to observe here is that the mean, so higher on this scale is more ideologically conservative, and lower on this scale is more ideologically liberal. And the lines represent the means. And what I want you to observe here is the bifurcate, the spread between where Republicans and Democrats are. So Republicans and Democrats have gotten further apart from one another, which is one way we define and measure polarization. And most of that is because Republicans have gotten more conservative than Democrats have gotten more liberal, right? So we see more upward slope here than downward slope there. But the spread is about similar to the spread between the two that we saw in 1860, if you remember what went on then. This is similar point, different data. So here, red and blue are not Republican and Democrat, they are House and Senate. So, and the y-axis is not ideology, it's the distance between the parties. So higher on this scale is more polarized between the parties, and lower is less polarized between the parties. And this goes from the 1880s until about 2010 or so. And so what I want you to observe here is first, this is a correlation coefficient. The House and the Senate are highly related in terms of how polarized they are. They sort of follow each other. Polarization is greater in the House than it is in the Senate, but they both are going up. And there's 2 things I really want you to take away from this. Number 1, this didn't start in 2016. This trend of polarization starts in the 1970s. So what we are experiencing now is a culmination of something that started 50 years ago on this trend. Number 2, the House and the Senate have very similar levels of polarization. So people who are running around claiming that you can fix democracy and fix polarization by getting rid of gerrymandering, this is the only graph you need to show them. We don't gerrymander the Senate. We haven't changed the shape of the states in quite a long time. The Senate's not getting gerrymandered, yet it has the same level of polarization as the House. Right? So it's not the gerrymandering that causes the polarization. I'll get to more about what does cause polarization in a second. But it's not just the elites or the elected people who are polarized. The mass public also is polarized. So these are data from the Pew Research Center. The blue hump, this is from 1994, people who say they're liberal, people who say they're conservative. And so the distribution of people who identify as liberal and the distribution of people who identify as conservative. 2 things to notice. One is the overlap between these 2 curves is quite a lot. And 2, the distance between the median is fairly narrow in 1994. In 2017, same graph, we now have much less overlap between those distributions and much wider distance between the medians. So polarization is a top-down process. Elites polarize first, and then the public does, because we take our political cues from political elites. And this is telling us that it's not just that Congress is polarized, the mass public is polarized as well. So where does polarization come from? The number 1 story I want to tell about where polarization comes from, and I'm not going to go deep into this, I'm just going to throw it out there, is inequality. Inequality, this graph is showing from the post-war period, 1947 until 2011. On this y-axis here, you have Gini coefficient. A Gini coefficient is a measure of economic inequality. So the greater difference you have between the rich and the poor, essentially, the higher your Gini coefficient. So this graph is showing, and the dotted line is polarization, and it's going to be mass polarization here. And so what we're not mass polarization, it's House party medians. So it's polarization in the House of Representatives. And so essentially what this graph is showing descriptively, this is not a causal analysis, but descriptively they're correlated. As we get greater income inequality, we get greater polarization. Research is still ongoing to help understand this relationship better. We don't really know exactly why. There's lots of theories and there's lots of suppositions about what causes this relationship, but we do know that there is a robust, not just in the United States, but a robust relationship between inequality and partisan polarization. This is talking about economic inequality. In the United States, we can talk about lots of inequalities. We can talk about racial inequality, access to healthcare inequality, access to education inequality, the racial wealth gap. We can talk about income inequality, and we can talk about wealth inequality as different things. But however you slice it, and in fact, some of those slices look quite a bit worse than this one, we see this strong relationship. So inequality is generally driven by, polarization is generally driven by inequalities. And if you go back and think about that time trend, so the argument that I'm making is that polarization starts in the 1970s. So there are economic policies and that start in the 70s, also in the 1980s, and other fiscal policies that come into play that put into place the mechanisms that are needed to generate this inequality. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but the first graph you showed us, you said it was descriptive, not causal.
Correct.
But you just said inequality drives polarization. So is it in fact causal? Or we don't know? They're certainly correlated, obviously.
They are strongly correlated.
Okay.
To be perfectly honest, in my mind, I think of them as a causal relationship. To me, one of the prescriptions for how to deal with the political crises that we have is to address inequalities. That being said, putting purely my social scientist hat on, I cannot give you a direct scientific study that shows a direct causal relationship, because it's a very complicated relationship.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, another part of this story, in addition to inequalities, is about partisanship and sorting. So the other thing that's gone on over the last 50 years is that parties have sorted by identities and ideologies. So I'm going to attempt to oversimplify something using a weird visualization. And this is just a demonstration. This is not real data. This is made up data just for the demonstration purposes. So if you break people up into categories where you've got class, lower, middle, upper class, ideology, conservative and liberal, and race, non-white and white. If you have a sorting where that people from all of these categories sort of equally sort into the two political parties, then you get political parties that are very diverse in terms of who comprises them. However, and in the 20th century, more or less, very broad brushstrokes here, we had something that looked closer to this, at least in terms of ideologies. We had political parties that contained both conservative and liberal ideologies in both political parties. And that created the foundations toward the engagement of all kinds of political compromise. But then what has happened is that the parties have sorted on these demographic and ideological lines. So if you are conservative ideology, white race, and lower class, you are much more likely to sort yourself into the Republican Party, have Republican Party ID than Democratic Party ID. If you are non-white, liberal, upper class, middle class, you are more likely to sort yourself into the Democratic Party ID. The fact that partisanship neatly maps onto ideology, and when I tell my students this, they kind of flip out, is weird, right? My 20-year-old students are like, what do you mean it's weird? Of course conservatives are Republican and liberals are Democrats. How could it be any other way? And I'm like, it's weird. And it's not just weird, it's unstable. It's an unstable relationship for politics to have parties that are sorted by ideology, which is essentially what we have here. But it's not just ideology. We've also sorted our parties on class and race lines in many ways. And so as you do that, it reinforces people's political identities. And people aren't just forming their political identities by their demographic categories or whatnot. One of the main ways that people are forming their identities these days is through a process known as negative partisanship. So this is this is a type of partisanship that's very emotional, very reactive, where you're defining your party in-group, who you identify with, not by what you believe or who you are or what your policy preferences are, but rather by what you aren't, right? So lots and lots of people have antipathy towards the out party, right? They feel okay about their own party, but they feel really increasingly bad about the out party. The out party is the party you don't identify with. So if you're a Democrat, you think Republican, you think very poorly of Republicans. If you're a Republican, you think very poorly of Democrats. And so anything if you're a Republican who thinks poorly of Democrats, anything you see that you take as Democrat coded in some way, and it could be anything from a beer commercial to a political candidate, you're going to say, oh, those aren't my people, I am against that, right? Having nothing to do with like rational thought process and having everything to do with emotional reaction to in-group and out-group safety. Right? People feel safe in their in-groups, and they are defining their own psychological political safety by finding their safe group by identifying who is not in their in-group. We can see this really clearly when we ask people about policy. So our politics now, partisans will adjust their policy preferences to match their party identification rather than the other way around. So for example, this is a survey from the former website known as 538 that asked people who, do you think the economy is getting worse? So higher up on this scale is economy is getting worse, and lower down on this scale is economy is getting better. So in 2016, before Donald Trump is inaugurated in January 2017, in 2016, Republicans say definitely getting worse. 70% of Republicans say economy is getting worse, and Democrats say, only 10% say economy is getting worse. As soon as the president is inaugurated, it completely flips. Now Republicans will say, very few, less than 5% say the economy is getting worse, and more Democrats say, yeah, economy is getting worse. Until you get to, well, this is coronavirus, Inauguration Day. Joe Biden is inaugurated, exact same thing. Democrats plummet from 70% saying economy is getting worse to 9% saying the economy is getting worse. The economy doesn't change that fast, okay? People are changing their perceptions based on their party in-group and out-group identifiers, right? So we have this psychological process where there's this idealized form of democracy, and since we're in a library, I'll shout it out. There's a great book by Chris Aiken and Brandon Bartels called Democracy for Realists. And in Democracy for Realists, they talk about the folk theory of democracy. And the folk theory is this idealized form of democracy where you develop your beliefs and attitudes, stuff that your parents taught you, and your religion, and ethics, and so forth, and then you apply that to various policy questions, and you come up with your policy attitudes, and then you go looking for the candidates and parties that represent your attitudes, and you vote for them. This is the idealized form about how democracy works. And then, in the folk theory, if your policy preferences or candidates don't work out, you hold them accountable and you vote them out and then go again. And in reality, what happens is people are choosing their partisanship first, their in-group first, and then selecting their policy preferences on top of that. So it really breaks the ability for the system to provide accountability, right? So that's problematic. Okay, point number, I guess, 7 on the how did we get here is this is data that comes from the VDEM Institute. I was showing some of their data in a graph I didn't really explain before. They have plotted a 2-dimensional ideological scale for lots of political parties around the world. So the grayed out things on here are political parties in Bolivia and Hungary and Germany and the UK and so forth. But I have Republicans and Democrats highlighted. So the x-axis is the traditional ideological scale, left-right economic ideological scale. More government intervention and socialism over here, and less government intervention and more free market over here. The y-axis is what we define as illiberalism. So illiberalism is the extent to which you reject political pluralism, you demonize your political opponents, you disrespect fundamental minority rights, you encourage political violence, and so forth. And so the higher up you are on the illiberalism scale, the more you're kind of adhering to or attracted to those anti-democratic values. And what we see is we have a plot here that includes the Democrats in the year 2000 and the Democrats in the year 2018, and they kind of don't move. They're down here in this lower left quadrant. But the Republican Party here is in 2000, 2002, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018. So what we've seen is a real shift in the Republican Party, not on the traditional ideological left-right scale, but on the illiberalism scale. So the Republican Party has become, its leaders really, have become more attracted to policies and forms of governments that are illiberal. Okay, I have a couple slides on the expansion of executive authority that I am going to skip in favor of time. And I'm just going to, for the sake of very simplistic arguments, sometimes people say, well, why hasn't the Constitution saved us from this? Like, what's broken? What's not working? And this is my most simple answer. We had a constitutional system that when the Constitution was written, they left out two super important things. Anybody want to take guesses? There's two super important things that we left out of the Constitution. What would you say?
Enforcement mechanisms?
Yeah, well, there are some in the executive, in Article 2. There's some enforcement mechanisms, but fair answer. What else you got?
Presidential authority.
Lots of presidential authority is baked into the Constitution.
Political parties.
Bingo! Political parties. Nowhere in the Constitution does it mention political parties. In fact, the founders thought that parties were bad. George Washington gives his famous farewell speech about the danger of factions, which was what they called parties. And so they built a system with this checks and balances, 3 branches of government, and we're going to give each one a little bit of a power over the other one so that we have built-in mechanisms of accountability. And they thought that by doing, and you add on top of that federalism, and they thought that by doing that they wouldn't need parties, that they could prevent parties from forming because the accountability and checks were already baked in. And they were wrong. Democracies require political parties. Political parties are an essential institution for democracies. You can't organize voters or candidates without political parties. And so what we have now is a system that, because of what's gone on with our political parties and our polarization, is that the checks and balances aren't working because it doesn't account for political parties. By the way, I skipped it. The other thing that they left out of the Constitution was eradicating slavery. Those two big errors, slavery and parties, is basically explains why we're here. So we essentially don't have an impeachment mechanism. It's written there in the Constitution, but as you may have observed, it essentially doesn't work. And so we have a system where it's almost impossible to place checks on the executive. Which is how we're getting an executive that is usurping so much authority. Okay, I'm not going to leave everybody on a totally sour note. There is some bright spots at the end of this. What happens next? So one thing to observe is we're seeing a huge resurgence in protest activity in the United States. So this is data that's been collected that is cataloging the number of protests in the first year of Trump 1 administration and in the first year of the Trump 2 administration. So we've basically quadrupled the amount of protest activity going on relative to this same time in the first Trump administration. Political scientist Erica Chenoweth has been very busy lately. She's on television and radio all the time talking about her research, because what she has done is studied the relationship between public protest and regime change. Like, at what point does a society rise up so much against their rulers that the ruling party actually falls, right? And she actually has been able to answer that question by aggregating things and studying the data. And the answer is 3.5%. Once 3.5% of the population is regularly and vigorously engaged in protest against their ruler, then those regimes become unstable and tend to fall. So for those of you doing the math at home, that's about 12 million Americans. So if we get to the point with the No Kings protest and whatever else is going on, and it's not just like a one-time thing, it's like a regular thing where 12 million people are in the streets. On the one hand, it's a very small proportion of the population. On the other hand, 12 million people make some noise. And so her research is, and this is not prescriptive and it's not determinative. This is not saying that should you get 12 million people that the next day something happens, right? And it's not magic, and there is a confidence interval around this number. And so take it with a grain of salt. But that is to say that in democracies that experience backsliding, this is one of the things we've observed. The most likely scenario for the near future, just to be perfectly plain logical about it, when parties that favor authoritarianism win office, we will have more authoritarian-style government in the United States. When parties that favor democracy win office, we'll have more democratic governance in the United States. I know that sounds super silly and super simple, but that's literally what you should expect for the next decade or so. So it's reasonable to expect the United States to essentially swing between these extremes over the next several election cycles. This is essentially what I expect to have happen. It is an unstable equilibrium, if you can call it. It's not exactly the right word because there's a lot of dynamic movement in there. So it's not a pattern that I think is very sustainable for very long. And we have other research that supports the idea that it's unstable. Oh, one slide is skipped. Hold on, I'm going to come back to this slide because I think I put it in the wrong place. This is it. I'll go back to the other one. Some scholars have shown, they studied democratic backsliding in hundreds of governments and have looked at what they call the U-turn effect. So this is countries that start as liberal democracies, countries that start as electoral democracies, countries that start as electoral autocracies, and countries that start as closed autocracy. And over a course of time, how much swing do we see between one form of regime to another? And essentially, for the liberal democracies and the electoral democracies, we do get a fair amount of backsliding. Like all of these, this is all backsliding. This is all backsliding. But also, most of those come back to being electoral democracies, right? So it suggests that for many countries that experience democratic backsliding, there is a U-shaped phenomenon that occurs. And the time frame in which that occurs, of course, varies from country to country. But it's generally kind of 8 to 10 years-ish, right? It's difficult to say when you would put the starting point for the United States. I don't know what the starting point is, and I don't think we will really know until 50 years from now, until retrospect. But to think that the next 2 presidential election cycles are critical for reestablishing democratic control and democratic governance is absolutely critical. Because the other thing that the research shows is that for countries who experience backsliding and within the first 8 to 10 years don't have democratic resurgence, they actually stay authoritarian for a really long time, right? So the next few election cycles are really critical in the United States. Okay, now I'll go backwards. So what helps to restore democracy? So this is, I'll go all the way back. This goes back to the 4 things. And so one thing you have to do is recommit to democratic norms and institutions to reduce illiberal practices. So don't threaten your political opponents, don't ban criticism, don't engage or encourage election interference, all of this kind of stuff. And don't support candidates who do that and criticize those that do, right? Second, recommit to civil liberties. Leaders must restore best practices for media independence, for free speech, and for open criticism of government. Third, recommit to anti-corruption. We have to punish those who participate in corrupt practices regardless of their partisanship. Number 4, engage in institutional reform. Identify institutional weaknesses and make reforms to strengthen democratic practices. I've got ideas about that. And this is the timing thing. For those first 1 or 2 cycles after autocratization begins, there's a critical window for restoring democracy. A U-turn is most likely to occur in this window if we can do some of these things, right? This is what is required. Okay, so here's my wish list, because I get to have wish lists. So if I had a magic wand, this is what I would do. Number 1, this is always my number 1, get rid of single member districts. In the US House, we have 435 congressional districts. We elect 1 member from each congressional district. That essentially is what drives our 2-party system. right? I'm not going into all of Duverger's laws of logic, but essentially you can create multipartyism in the United States by changing the electoral rules. And the preferred way a political scientist would do that is to create multi-member congressional districts. So instead of the Virginia legislature right now talking about making a 10-to-1 Democratic to Republican congressional district map, I would say just make 11 representatives from Virginia and vote on them. Make the whole state one district with 11 reps. I mean, that's not actually what I would do, but something closer to that. If every state did that, and by the way, you could do this without amending the Constitution, you just have to change a law that would allow multi-member districts in the House, it would move the United States towards a multi-party system. Now, multi-partyism has real downsides, right? Multi-partyism gives abhorrent political parties a legitimate lane and seats in legislatures, right? I'm not saying multi-partyism is some kind of magic pill that makes everything better, but I do think that one of the problems in our democracy is lots of people feel disaffected, they feel unrepresented, they don't feel like a good connection with their they're responding by negative partisanship rather than by something positive, and if we had multiple political parties, it would address some of that lack of representation. Number 2, campaign finance reforms. So Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976 Supreme Court decision, essentially told us that money is speech. And this is a problem because money is in fact access to power. And restricting campaign donations to constituents. So what if the person, is James Walkinshaw this district? Are you guys Virginia 11th? What is Falls Church? You guys are 10th?
Don Byer.
Oh, Byer, you're Byer, okay. So imagine Don Byer could only accept political campaign contributions from people in his constituency. Nobody from outside your district could donate to him. Imagine every political representative only being it, so no more big corporate PAC donations, all of that would be gone, right? Number 3, anti-corruption. Hold to account those who have abused power, held public office for profit seeking, and ban office holders from making investments, various investments. This one's really critical. If we don't hold lawbreakers to account, things will get repeated. Number 4, voting rights for all. DC statehood or incorporation into existing states, territories liberated. Let's not do colonialism anymore. 3 million people in Puerto Rico and elsewhere will thank us. Either grant them statehood or grant them liberty, and true immigration reform that deals with our struggles with citizen sovereignty. And my last one is policies to address income and wealth inequality. So some of these I put in an institutional reform bucket, and some are in a policy reform bucket. And my policy reform bucket is all about addressing those things that started the trend of polarization to begin with. I mean, some of that was partisan identity, but some of it is also inequality. So tax policies that would provide guaranteed health care and reduce the income and wealth gap. This is the last side. So where do we go from here? You should expect threats to democracy to continue, especially those to the rule of law. Democracy is not guaranteed. Nothing I've said here is prescriptive. Democracy is not guaranteed to fail. It is not guaranteed to be resurgent. The future is written by people who show up in the present and demand things, right? So reforms and democratic restoration will only happen because masses of people demand it. Roughly 12 million regularly, loudly, and hopefully very civilly demand it. So think globally, act locally. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your lecture. My name is Yan. So I came to the U.S. I grew up in China. I came to the U.S. in my 30s. So I really enjoy democracy. I feel like the great thing is I feel like I can be myself. I don't have to be afraid of anybody. If I criticize Trump at least, I wouldn't be afraid of being arrested, put in prison without due process. And so, but
I wish I could share your feelings.
I'm sorry. I think I would like to make one comment first. I think I came here, so I didn't know much about how democracy really works, and but over the years I learned, and I was disappointed. I feel like the U.S. is hopelessly bipartisan, and which is kind of sad for me because I think democracy is great, and I would hate to see the country goes done the past more divided because globally we need a more united country. That's my perspective. So I was hoping to hear more about why the country has been so divided, the partisanship, the history. You mentioned that you showed the chart, but I was hoping to hear more like about the history, what caused this. And so maybe another lecture.
Yeah, perhaps another lecture. So in addition to talking more about inequality and its relationship to, let me just repeat. The question is about a little bit more detail on what causes partisan polarization to begin with. So in addition to the inequalities that I mentioned in that other lecture, I would also talk about the reorganization or the resorting that the political parties went through post the civil rights era. So in the middle of the 20th century, you have, as I said earlier, conservatives and liberals that exist in both political parties. As you go through the civil rights era, Civil Rights Act is passed in 1964, Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965, and millions of African Americans in the South re-earn the franchise after the 1965. And a lot of people would say that somewhere between 1965 and 2013, that was like peak democracy for the United States. Because that is where most people, like we had the strongest version of voting rights for most people. Lots of political scientists define democracy by voting rights. And so between 1965 and 2013, we had peak voting right protection for the most people. 2013 is, by the way, the Supreme Court case Shelby County versus Holder, which decimated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which is why I picked that end date. So you could argue that the decline started then. In any case, there's huge backlash. Every time in US history that we have had progress towards racial equality, whether you're talking about the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, or you're talking about anti-lynching campaigns in the early 20th century, the Civil Rights Movement in the mid-20th century, the Black Lives Matter movement in this century, every single one of those time points, the advances that were made for racial equality are followed by a backlash, by basically a white racial backlash against those advances. And those periods of backlash include, that is the authoritarianism that has always been in the United States, right? So after Reconstruction ends in 1877, after the Civil War, we go through a period between 1877 and 1965. There is the Jim Crow period in the South. So people who are saying, U.S. is a democracy, we've always been a democracy, I would say we weren't a democracy actually until 1965, largely because of the lack of expansion of voting rights. And so there was authoritarianism, absolute one-party autocratic control in the South for almost 100 years, right? It was just regionalized and not well appreciated other places. After we go through the civil rights period in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, it's followed by an explicit strategy to try to court the white racial conservatives basically away from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. That sorting takes another decade or two to happen, but once it does, then we get this perfect sorting of ideology. And all of that transformation of how people align to the political parties is a huge part of the story of polarization. You don't get polarization without that political sorting having gone on. So that's another big thing that I
Thank
would.
you so much. I have another question though.
Do you mind if I ask others, and I'll come back to you, I promise. Let me just take one from this side of the room. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, how does our democratic performance at the state and local level factor into the analytical framework that you've developed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't have good measures of that. There's a lot of quantitative work going on right now comparing the United States to other countries. And a lot of that is done through elite surveys. Some of it is more objective, like the stuff I tried to do with the website stuff. But we do not have great systematic analysis at the state level. We've got a lot of variation there, right? So Virginia right now is going through this gerrymandered thing that's not great for democracy. California has approved their gerrymander thing. Good, well-intentioned in terms of sort of fighting national autocratic forces, but also a form of democratic backsliding itself to engage in it, right? So it's a mixed bag. Texas, they already gerrymandered, but some of that is getting kicked back, so that's, all of this is to say that there's huge variation across the states. Some states are doing better in terms of how the relationship between the governor and the legislature and their judiciary, like each state does it a little bit differently. And so we see some variation in how well states are able to sort of counteract their own authoritarian forces that grow within their states. Indiana's a great example. President Trump recently tried to get the members of the Indiana legislature to gerrymander their district, and the Republicans who were very much in charge there basically said, no, this is the wrong thing to do. They sort of stood on principle and against their party and the leader of their party. So there's huge variation, and I don't have anything systematic to say, except to say that it's all over the map at this point. But it's an important variation to appreciate, though, for sure.
In my lifetime, I could easily cite 2 examples of a political party enforcing norms of decency and respect for the law and so forth. Democrats keeping George Wallace off the presidential ballot in 1968. It's not because he was losing primaries, it's because the Democratic leaders kept him off.
That's an example of party strength.
Exactly, party
Yes.
strength from inside. And Republicans going to Richard Nixon and saying, you've
Yes.
got to step down or we're going to impeach you. I mean, a party enforcing itself.
Yes.
And I don't see that happening now at all. What's that about?
Yeah, no, those are great examples. I forgot to repeat the last question, but this question is about mentioning 2 examples from history where George Wallace, Democrats kept George Wallace from running for president in 1968, right? And then Nixon being essentially forced to resign by his own party. His own party asked him to step down. So again, the story here is going to come back to partisan polarization. In the 1970s, we arguably had pretty awesome political parties at the time. We were post-civil rights era. We weren't fully into the backlash era yet, although the Southern strategy, which was an explicitly a white-centered strategy to court white voters into the Republican Party from their Democratic Party ID, was Richard Nixon's brainchild. But that wasn't like in total full swing yet. So we were kind of, to me, still at the beginning of our peak democracy period. And political parties were strong. We had passed campaign, so the first campaign finance laws get passed in 1974 and 1975. And so that's helping to make parties more robust and give them more control. Democrats had a few not great experiments with sort of trying to democratize their party after their disastrous 1968 convention that ended in riots and all kinds of disasters. They democratized and then they took it back because it didn't work out well. But parties were arguably at that time, both political parties were doing the work that you need parties to do. And some of that work is recruiting quality candidates that support the values and institutions of the governing regime, right, of the governance. One of the most common explanations for how 2016 went is that the Republican Party essentially didn't do its job. It was the party's job to keep unqualified candidates from the ballot. And in some ways they did. I don't know how well you all remember how the primaries went in 2016. There were a lot of Republicans that were active, and all of the sort of mainstream, you had Jeb Bush, you had, why is Bush the only one that came to my mind?
Rubio.
You had Rubio, you had Cruz, you had all of these kind of mainstream politicians, Chris Christie, and they, each one kind of had a turn at the top of the polls, and they didn't ever stay there very long, largely because Donald Trump started winning elections, and which they thought he wouldn't do. They thought that the party, because all of its endorsees and all of its money and so forth was coalescing around the traditional machine. Meanwhile, Trump rode a wave of populism that the party simply couldn't react to. So arguably what the party should have done was, before Trump won too many elections, they should have picked a candidate. They should have backed a horse. They should have just said, okay, Marco Rubio, it's your turn. Whether he wins or loses, we're actually going to pick a party person and not let populism take over the party. And that probably would have kept Trump off the ballot, right, from winning.
Room.
Yeah, a smoke-filled room, exactly. Democratization in political parties, I'm sorry to say, is kind of a bad thing. You actually need people who understand what's going on to make competitive, reasonable selections about party nominations. And so the failure of the Republicans to coordinate in that party nomination process essentially explains Trump's rise and the populism that he rode on. Yes?
It was in your slides, but you didn't get to talk to it, but it's something I'm interested in about expanding the House of Representatives.
Ooh, yeah.
Because it hasn't been expanded in 100 years
It
almost.
hasn't, you're right.
And so it's not nearly as representative.
I'm on team double it.
As it was intended to
You mean expand the numbers or make them all, every state one district? Or is it
No,
just-
so the question is about expanding the House of Representatives, and we have not expanded from 435 seats in around 100 years, and so I think we are absolutely overdue. The modern congressional district represents about 750,000 people. It's just a huge population for one person to try to represent. So I would love to see us double, go from 435 to whatever that is times 2, number of representatives in the House, in addition to other things. I would also do violent things to the Senate, but I won't talk about that. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the population of your students
Yeah.
and sort of how diverse are they? Or do people that take your class, because you said you condensed a 3-month syllabus into what you've done with us today. I'm curious about their views and how, what type of...
I do not have enough lovely things to say at George Mason University students. Mason students are awesome. Partly because I'm a political science professor, and so students who come to Mason particularly to study government have self-selected into a university near DC. We get fantastic students. We get students at Mason who, academically wise, many of them could go anywhere, but they've come to Mason for financial or whatever other reasons. We do have a fat tail at the other end. We do get a hefty number, our acceptance rate is 93% or something like that. So we do get a handful of students who are not really prepared for college. But your question is about diversity.
Yeah.
Mason is an extremely diverse student
Right,
population.
right.
It's ethnically diverse, it's economically diverse, it is politically diverse, but it mostly looks like most college campuses, like it leans liberal. That being said, there's a tradition at Mason. There's these like park benches that line up along the square near the library, and the student clubs can, for a semester, like paint a bench. There's a whole contest about who gets to paint the benches. And so I noticed like there is some very conservative organizations on campus because I've seen their painted benches. Like Turning Points USA had a painted bench for a while and so forth. So there are definitely conservative students at Mason, but I wouldn't say there's more conservative students at Mason relative to any other big, 30,000 students.
Right, just curious if you
campus
take your class.
population. Oh, in my classes
In your class,
particularly?
Yeah.
I'll be honest and say, first I'll be honest and say I am quite gratefully, blissfully on research sabbatical this semester. I am writing a book at the moment in residence at the Library of Congress, and I am delighted to not be in the classroom and dealing with department drama right now. I get a research sabbatical once every 6 years, and it's terrific. 10 out of 10, would recommend. But every fall I teach Introduction to American Government, which is a big survey class, lots of students. And this past fall, it was different. I don't think I was different. I've been teaching this class more than 20 years. Like I've taught the same class, well not exactly the same, but I'm the same. The students are more reluctant to talk. They are not as free, I don't know, it's like what you were talking about a minute ago. They don't feel as free to express their opinions. I don't even think they feel as solid in what their political opinions are as students did just a few years ago, really. So getting them to open up is becoming more the challenge. And I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's because they feel threatened. They are the generation who has grown up online, and most of the political engagement they've ever had has been online. And online political engagement, I don't know if you know, but is a toxic shithole.
Right.
Sorry, I'm probably not supposed to say that.
Right.
And so if all they've ever seen is emotional reactivity to politics, I have this whole theory that I have not tested, I don't know how to, that young people today have a sense of trauma associated with politics. You think about the students in my class, they were in 3rd grade when Donald Trump was first elected president, right? All they've ever known is Trump as the political party leader of the Republican Party. They've lived through COVID and think of all the other traumas in the world. This is all they know about politics. They don't know it any other way. And so I think many of them have a trauma response where it's very difficult for them to think from the frontal lobe, to think rationally and objectively and neutrally about politics, and it's all from the amygdala, it's all just emotional reaction, because that's all they've ever experienced, that's all they've ever observed. And so for me to walk into a classroom and say, hi, we're gonna put on lab coats and be analytical about politics is really hard for them. Like, for a lot of them, I just can't get them there in the course of one semester. In a way that, 10 years ago, yes, that was true. Maybe they'd never thought about this way of politics before, but it wasn't hard to get them there, and now it's hard to get them there. And so that, to me, is a sign of this broader change we're observing. Thank you for that great question. Yeah.
If you can, in a nutshell, do you have anything to say about the Supreme Court and its capitulation to the executive power and social media and AI and how it influences all this?
Okay, so the question is about the Supreme Court's role in all of this and social media AI. On the Supreme Court, the big problem here is that the Supreme Court has become, I don't want to say, for lack of a better word, victim of the broken polarization process. So you remember, the reason we have 3 Trump-appointed judges on the Supreme Court is because back in 2016, when Antonin Scalia died and President Obama wanted to appoint his successor, Republicans who controlled the Senate floor, Mitch McConnell was the Republican leader at the time, simply refused to hold the hearings for like 8 or 9 months. Gambling that a Republican might win the next election, that gamble turned out to work out well for him. So that is sort of a stolen seat in that sense. Like, we should have more partisan balance. We don't think of the justices as partisan, but everybody is. And they all have attitudes as well, and preferences. And so that's one that he really shouldn't have had. And then there was another irregularity. So I'm less critical of that one. Ginsburg passed away a month before the election in 2020. Wait,
Yeah.
my timeline is all mixed up.
2020.
Whatever the year was. What was it?
2020.
2020.
Yeah.
And so, of course, in 2016, the argument was you can't do this during an election year, and so that obviously was totally yes the whole time. We all knew that. But everything they did in that instance was totally constitutional. Like, I actually think it's fine that they rushed through a nomination process in 4 weeks. It's not a violation of the rule of law. The other one was. The other one was a major violation of both, well, not necessarily law, but at least major democratic norms, right? So that imbalance in partisanship on the court is because of the breakdown of norms and rule of law that we have experienced up until this point, right? These are not unrelated things. People talk about court reform. I think there's different versions of that. I'm not a court expert. I'm a Congress expert, so this isn't really my area of expertise. But I think people who talk about putting term limits on court justices, serve 18 years type thing, or some type of regular rotation, or I don't know. There's different ideas out there, or expanding the court. Starts to sound like FDR, who also, by the way, was kind of an authoritarian. There are ideas that I think could improve democratic norms and strengthen institutions in the court. Whether or not we actually see any of those reforms anytime soon, I don't know. I honestly it's not on my wish list, though, and maybe it's because I'm a Congress scholar, and so that's where my bias is. But I really think you have to fix the voting rights, the representation stuff, the sources of polarization. I mean, arguably you could do all that stuff and the Supreme Court could kind of unfairly stomp that stuff down. That would be problematic. But if you were going through a period of great reform like that, it would be hard to see that happening. But I don't know. Anyway, the other one was about AI and social media. Honestly, the evidence there is kind of mixed. And I haven't seen a lot of studies on AI yet, and AI's influence on politics. It's too new. The studies haven't come yet, so I don't really have anything to say about AI yet, except to the extent that we can generalize about problematic information environments and misinformation and so forth, and conspiracy. But with social media, there was a time when, the early studies on social media, a decade ago or so, suggested that the concerns that social media was amplifying polarization were perhaps overstated. Because most people, depending on what platform you're on, most people in their social media feed are actually getting exposed to countervailing ideas. Most people who are on social media are not fully in information bubbles. And even if you're arguing with them, or if it's like a toxic exchange or whatever, there's still exposure to the countervailing ideas. And so those early studies on the role of the relationship between social media and things like polarization and breakdown of democratic norms made me more skeptical about the problematic nature of social media. Since then, we've had social media sources bought by partisans. We've had, things have changed a lot. You know, the next round of studies that come out, I think might tell a slightly different story. But what I think is really important to recognize is that most people are not online. Like, you all came out on a very cold day to a library to hear a talk about politics. You're not normal people, I'm sorry. Like, you guys may be online and see your stuff, but like, this is not America. This is people who are very engaged, very informed, want to learn stuff, etc. Most people are not that. Most people don't really, like, whenever you see the polls about number of people who identify as Democrats and Republicans, and the number of people who say they're independent is just going up and up and up, there's a couple of different reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that most people don't read about, know about, care about politics. And so they just say they're independent because and because everything else is so toxic, it feels safer. Or they have antipathy for one of the party labels, which is also a thing. And so online people are very partisan. They're very engaged. They're more likely to be engaged or to believe in conspiracy theories and all kinds of problematic or get exposed to misinformation and so forth. But that's not most people. Like the Twitterverse, the Blue Sky verse, the Instagram verse, whatever it is still not most people. So yes, problematic, but again, not going to be the top of my list of things we got to worry about. Yeah, sure.
I have a question. You were talking about the kind of when democracy starts to backslide, you have like that 8 to 10 year period where you might be able to kind of course correct. And I'm just looking at the future, and the most optimistic that this is coming from a bit of a partisan view, but if the Dems win in 28, but
Yeah.
then with the demographic changes in the Electoral College in the 2030 census, it might be harder
Yes.
for them to win re-election in 2032. So
Yes.
in 32, it goes back to the GOP, and if they don't drastically change their ways, if you will, then we start backsliding again. So does the U-shape just start all over again, and then hopefully the Dems, fingers crossed, win in 2036, and then the U-shape goes back up? Like, what does that look like? It looks like a roller coaster.
What you're describing would be truly chaotic. So the question is about the U-term and the U-curve and the 8 to 10 year window that I was talking about earlier, and how realistic that is if the presidency, say, oscillates between Republican and Democrat over the next decade or so. Of course, the true answer is I have no idea. But in reality, in order for the U-curve to be predictive of America's future, it would have to be the case not only that the party that is more interested in democratic governance wins elections and wins them like decisively, like by wide margins and clear majorities and like decisive winning. But it's also going to have to be the case that they use that authority to engage in reforms, which is actually the part I'm more worried about at this point. Democrats, I don't know if you've noticed, are not a very well organized party. They have a lot of factions within them that have a hard time coordinating on policy. Thankfully, governing and campaigning are two totally different realms, and I think they can campaign one way and govern differently, and draw on policy expertise for the governance part. But for the U-turn to happen, it both have to be the case that Democrats win, they win decisively, and then they engage in, maybe not my wish list exactly, but some reforms that look like accountability and restore democratic norms and institutions. It's not going to be like, again, magic pill, but even if it's just like 4 or 5 critical things, that could be enough to, plus at some point, sorry to be like, Trump's going to die someday. And it's not clear how the succession in the Republican Party is going to do. I don't think Vance is a natural successor. He has this charismatic populist appeal that nobody else in the party seems to have. It seems more likely to me that the Republican Party could nominate somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene next round. I don't know, something, once Trump's off the scene, it's very difficult to predict where the party goes. And that process of how the Republican Party coordinates itself once Trump is off the scene, that's what we want to keep an eye on, because we're looking for them to reinforce democratic norms, not populism.
When you were saying like just regular people have such a negative view of the other party, so I don't see that changing. I mean, I agree there's not like a great leader on that side, but voters themselves might just have an appetite for more autocracy and
Maybe.
demand of their leaders.
I mean, fact of the matter is, there has always been one political party or another in United States history that has had an authoritarian sort of white racial supremacy viewpoint. For a long time it was contained in the Democratic Party. And it's only been within the last 50 years or so that it's moved into the Republican Party. And one historical view is the United States will continue on this oscillating thing until we deal with that, until we actually deal with some type of true reconciliation, compensation. If you've ever read Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay, The Case for Reparations, I highly recommend it. It's probably, I don't know, 15 years old. I think it might have been published in The Atlantic. This is a library. Surely somebody could find it somehow.
What was it called again? I'm sorry.
It's called The Case for Reparations, and it's written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a very well-known writer in the civil justice space.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
As I'm sure you saw, the post just laid off the reporter yesterday.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if you could sort of comment on the role of the legacy media in polarization. And I noticed it's not on your wish list, but I was curious if you have sort of solution or sort of how that might, what the media can do.
Yeah, so am I going to get the attribution right? I think it's Thomas Jefferson. I'm not sure if I'm getting the attribution right. I think it was Thomas Jefferson who has this famous quote about if you could have democracy without newspapers or newspapers without democracy, I should much prefer the latter, or what, I don't know, whatever. Basically, he is saying that having newspapers, having a free press is essential for democracies. How we define that and what that looks like in the modern era is challenging. Most people don't get newspapers. I'm one of the last people on earth who gets a daily newspaper on my driveway that I read every morning. Probably one other person there. Let's go. You and I, like those fees keep going up. And I will, even though my newspaper has now been bought by a billionaire, because, and I think about this a lot with respect to my students too, because young people kind of don't read, or they read in sound bites. It's hard to get them to read books. You can get them to read short articles. Like the way that information is both produced and consumed is just very different than Thomas Jefferson ever imagined it. So what does it mean to have quality journalism and free journalism that is publicly available in the digital age? I don't know how we should define that. I do think what we need, so part of this problem is that the business of journalism is fraught, right? Because the expenses are great to produce good journalism, and the revenues are poor for subscriptions. And so coming up with business models, new business models that can support journalism in some kind of, part for-profit, part not-for-profit, philanthropic, like, I don't know. I think we're gonna see people start to envision what new business models look like for news producers in ways that, like, this is not my area at all, but that's sort of where I hope it has to go at some point. The other thing is I hope we have some either funders or something or somebody that comes into space to help create local news again. The fact that we have nationalized media is a huge problem, right? Because all we're getting, and it's only going to get worse because every day more and more newsrooms are closing. But the fact that, politics is local, again, like, we have to act locally, and if we don't have information about what's going on in our own communities or counties, it's very difficult to do any of that. So without that, you don't have public accountability. Like, the Fourth Estate is the mechanism of public accountability. I'm sorry to say it's not elections. Elections do not provide accountability. The Fourth Estate does. And so figuring out, I don't know what the answers are, but somewhere along the way, we need smart, rich people to work on this problem. I don't know what it looks like. Yeah.
So you mentioned one of the things broken with our checks and balances is the impeachment process. What can be done to hold the president accountable? Is there some change we can make, like make the trial in the Senate an actual criminal trial, or make it a secret ballot or something? Because clearly impeachment is the way it is now is not a mechanism to hold the president accountable.
So arguably, so the question is about, like, if impeachment doesn't create accountability, like, how could we reform the process to create accountability? It's a great question. But it's not that, like, the constitutional design is wrong, it's that it doesn't work because of partisanship. And so to me, the fix is parties and representation. So multi-member districts, etc., would help a lot. If we stop recording for a second, I'll tell you, my real wish list would be like get rid of the Senate. Like let's just have like full-on parliamentary democracy kind of style. Like we probably can't really do away with presidentialism. That's going to require a new constitution. But like, or find a way to turn the Senate into a functional House of Lords type situation, so that the mechanism of accountability is basically this vote and whatever that would happen in the House, and it wouldn't depend on this second bicameral step. That's obviously a huge pie in the sky thing that's not really going to happen. And so what's really going to happen is parties. Like, the problem is the Republican Party has become illiberal. They don't favor, a majority of them don't favor democracy. But I don't know that that's like I'm perhaps being a little Pollyanna-ish. This might be my own wishful thinking naivete because I'm an optimist, but there are many Republicans who I think are just mercurial. They're on the Trump train because of the populism and because he holds the power, and so they follow him. Many of them have come to believe what he believes and are sold in to their white supremacist objectives. But I think many of them could come, I'd love to see Liz Cheney come back. I'd love to see Mitt Romney come back, or the people who are their proteges, right? Like the Republican Party needs people with some ideals who will come and engage in an oppositional way with Democrats that still adheres to democratic norms. Until we see the Republican Party do that, I don't know what the answer for
It
accountability
takes
is.
66 votes, right?
Yeah.
To condemn. And I don't think, except maybe in the early 19th century, there was ever a party that had 66 votes.
Democrats got, there's
Well,
been a
maybe
few
in the
times.
1930s.
There's been a few times.
But, I mean, it's pretty darn rare.
But the
that you're
two-thirds
ever gonna
threshold
get
is-
that vote to remove the president from power.
But again, that's because of partisanship, right? It's
Yeah.
because people are not judging based on, this is a trial, just the facts.
Yeah.
They're judging based on
When-
their partisan loyalty.
When Barry Goldwater went to Richard Nixon and said, "You've got to resign or you'll be impeached," Nixon said, "How many votes will I have against impeachment?"
Yeah.
And Goldwater said, 3, maybe 4, out of 100 senators.
Wow.
And
So
could you
it was-
imagine a Republican saying that to Trump today?
No.
You can't, right?
Not a man. A woman might say it.
Well, we know what he'd do to her. Oh, sorry. I need to stop talking about her. Yeah, go ahead. Your second question. Yeah.
patiently waiting.
You have. Go right
I
ahead.
learned a lot. Thank you. I want to ask the question. You mentioned the moderates. So my question is, what kind of role the moderates will play if we would have a multi-party? Because I support that too.
Well, I mean, I think if we, in my fantasy future, have a multi-party system and we move to multi-member districts for the House, I think there are studies and simulations that people have done to try to map out what the parties would look like. And U.S. would probably wind up with 5 or 6 parties, which is kind of a lot, but it's a really big country and there's a lot of political diversity. But there almost certainly would be a fairly large party that looks something like the Social Democrats in Germany, or like, sort of moderate left-leaning party and a countervailing, perhaps moderate right-leaning party. It's hard to say, but I do think that if we had multi-partyism, that would be a very robust coalition. That being said, I want to caution against putting too much stock in the one-dimensional ideological scale that we use to measure politics. It's not that meaningful for a lot of things anymore, right? Like in the same way that people will change their policy attitude based on which party is in power, their attitude about the economy, at that one graph that I showed. Or in the same way that Republicans actually haven't become all that much more conservative according to their party platform. What they've done is become more illiberal. Right? That's not a change in ideology, left-right ideology. It's a change in other kinds of values. I'm a social network scholar in terms of the quantitative analysis that I do, and I think of parties as factions. They are clusters. You have to think of them as organic beings that are constantly being recomposed every election cycle. So an election cycle is like a static moment that you capture during an election. Here are the people that identify or vote with or run with that party. And as soon as the election is over, that organism starts to shift again. Because if they won or they lost or this worked or that didn't work, or they all have their arguments about how we should, and you want that in a democracy. You want political parties to be constantly kind of reforming or remaking themselves in order to build the coalition that they think will be most advantageous in the next election cycle. Like, that's how it's supposed to work. So the hemming and hawing about Democrats infighting, like, I'm not worried about that. Like, I'm fine with the infighting. Let them go fight it out. Like, that, they're in the losing position right now. That's kind of what they're supposed to be doing. Like, I don't necessarily see that as problematic. The party doesn't have to come together to want one thing until they're in the position of needing to nominate a presidential candidate. Other than that, they can have all kinds of internal factions and do whatever they want because different people are getting elected using different aspects of that faction. I don't know if that's a way to answer your question
No,
exactly.
that makes
But
sense. Thank you.
yeah, sure.
If you have time for one more, where does the Electoral College stand? Is
Ugh.
that another whole lecture?
That's a whole. I actually do have a whole other lecture. I gave it at Green Spring last year. Electoral college sucks. That's a technical term. I mean, if you go back to the Constitution and the founding, what happens is they are arguing over what the executive branch should look like. They settle on presidentialism, not out of a, I would argue, I think the historical record suggests that it's not like a rationale, reasoned compromise that this is our presidentialism that we're going to have. It's, you know, Madison's arguing for one thing and Hamilton's arguing for another thing, and there's all these disagreements. And the Electoral College, like presidentialism itself, and the Electoral College specifically, is the, like, messy product of those negotiations that was nobody's actual idea. It was just like the, hybrid baby that was born from all of that argumentation. Because the forces at the time are people who want basically more elitism, like centralize the power, don't worry about populism, tyranny, etc., and people who are worried about too much central power and too much elitism. And that basic argument results in the Electoral College. The Electoral College is imbalanced because it's tied to apportionment in the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Senate is extraordinarily malproportioned. Hello, California and Wyoming. And so all of that malapportionment translates over into the Electoral College for the 538 seats there.
I got a quick. Isn't part of it, though, that to give some more power to the small states versus the larger states?
Yeah, but it's like a mathematical accident that is the case, right? It's because in Wyoming, which has, 600,000 people.
There was no
or whatever,
Wyoming in the 13 original colonies.
But they were smaller.
No, but the
was
math of the
Delaware.
arrangement
Delaware's small.
was that every state is going to get 2 senators, and then we're going to apportion the House by population. And at the time, there wasn't that much of a difference. I mean, there was in population, but not nearly the kind of differences we have today, obviously. And so the differentiation in that proportion just exacerbates over time as the country population and territory gets larger. I lost my train of thought. So what you wind up with, though, is Wyoming has much more representation, or a small state has much more representation in both the Senate and the Electoral College than a populous state like California, because of the math of both how many seats they get in the House and particularly the Senate. And literally the number of Electoral College seats that you get is directly tied to the number of House seats that you have. Virginia has 13 Electoral College votes because we have 11 congressional seats and 2 senators, so 11 plus 2 is 13, right? So that's how it works for every state, except DC, which gets 3 Electoral College votes and nothing in the House and Senate. Getting rid of the Electoral College, it's a real hard problem because there's no way to get rid of it without amending the Constitution. Well, we don't seem to do that anymore, which is another problem. That's a particular problem. And there are arguments out there, or there's something called the National Vote Compact. I'm getting the name wrong.
National Interstate Popular Vote Compact.
That's it. That was the official name. Essentially what it does is, and a fair number of states have signed on to it now, but it's an agreement where states have an agreement where they say, we will give all of our Electoral College votes to whichever candidate wins the popular vote. So that eventually, if enough states sign on to that, it effectively nullifies the Electoral College, and it would make the popular vote the binding vote.
Yeah.
The problem is only Democratic states essentially have signed on to that. And it has almost, and it actually doesn't really solve the problems. I have a whole other lecture I can give on this topic. But it's, I don't think it's a great solution, to be honest with you, the National Vote Compact. I don't have great answers for the Electoral College. I'm afraid we're stuck with it. Except to say that most of the time, we don't have upside-down elections. Most of the time, the popular vote winner and the Electoral College vote winner are the same. In your lifetimes, you've had 3 elections, or whatever, depending on how old you are, that have been upside-down elections. But it's not the norm. The reason we're seeing it more often is because of close races and polarization, and the malapportionment. Okay, I'm gonna make this the last one.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
So I'm looking at like the current cabinet and people in and around the administration, and I fear that they are kind of free to break the law because they're going to receive this blanket pardon. What can we do? Is there any way we can get rid of pardon power from the president?
No, because that one's in the Constitution. That's in Article 2.
So it would have to be amended, or
Yeah, and I mean, and there's probably arguments to do that, although I don't hear people talking about that particular reform. Again, it wouldn't be on the top of my list. What you need is to, again, just like rule of law, hold people accountable who break the law. And yeah, like, so you're imagining a scenario where Democrats come in, they hold some people accountable, they send them to jail, and then a Republican comes in and pardons all of those people.
Yeah.
So it's the
just
pardoning.
them right now, blanket pardon for
Yeah, it's all of those blanket pardons that are the violation of not the Constitution. But we think about in political science, we think about this as there are democratic institutions and then there are democratic norms. Somebody at the beginning of the lecture was talking about just having read How Democracies Die. It was over here. I don't remember who it was. So in that book, which you can also check out from this library, it's a delightful book. Actually, it's not delightful, but it's a good book. One of the things that you get from that is an appreciation that you can have all the democratic institutions and laws and rule of law lined up, you know, from here to forever. But if the culture doesn't support the norms of democracy, then it doesn't work. Like, the institutions alone are not sufficient. You have to have buy-in for, not villainizing your political opponents, for not criticizing reporters for doing their job, or for criticizing the president. Like, you have to have, as a society, people who buy into the democratic norms. Because what we're seeing is that without the norms, the institutions fail. The institutions or the norms are actually undergirding those institutional features. So the question of how do you change the norms, which is, I think, really what you're asking, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. Maybe we need an anthropologist or something to get more into how cultural norms develop. But what I do know is that it starts from the top. It starts from who do we honor as a society, who do we treat as our champions and our heroes, and what types of values do those people espouse. And when the leaders are consistently and vigorously supporting democratic norms like not villainizing your political opponents, then that tends to spread through the culture. So what the people at the top say and how they say it really matters.
So like the pardon, I don't really like when Democrats do it either, but the pardon power itself is just kind of here to stay.
Yeah, it is. One thing that will happen, though, I suspect, is that some of those people will get convicted at state levels, and so the presidential pardon doesn't affect state laws. And so, that is one teeny tiny shining bright light for federalism, which otherwise I think will walk away. All right, you guys have been awesome. Thank you all very much.